I'm going to start this first episode of the Difficult Dopamine Book Club. And the reason we call it the Difficult Dopamine, it was basically for John. John was looking for easy dopamine kicks. He was basically saying, look, give me something online. I said, no. What we've got to do is we've got to get our dopamine from something that actually is a little bit difficult, that takes it out of us. Okay. So the way we're going to do this, obviously, this is the book. Okay. Now, I'm not too sure how many are online now, right? But I think there's quite a few. So the way we're going to do this is the following. Eliza and John are sitting there. You'll see them, they're waving, right? What I want to do is I want to involve yourselves, much more than me blathering on for ages and ages and ages. I want to involve yourselves in the discussion as much as possible. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to ask you to look down, and if you see react down in your screen, okay? And if you see react, raise hand. If I do this, right? Little hand goes on here at the top, and then we will know that you want to talk. We will know that you've got something to say, you've a comment, etc. So the minute you have something to say, or if there's a part of the book you're really interested in, raise your hand. Then Eliza will unmute you. She'll be able to see you. And that is the way in which you'll then chat to me, but also chat to the others in terms of your perception of the book. Okay. And then lower your hand, you just do the same thing and you disappear. Okay. Now, the interesting thing is because I can't hear anybody now, I just have to assume from thumbs up of those who I can. So I can see Nick, I can see Sharon, I can see Mark, I can see Connor, and I can see Sean Carroll. That's at the top, across the top. I'm sure. So you can all hear me perfectly. Yeah. Wonderful. So welcome to the McWilliams living room. Okay. This is not where the podcast is done. The podcast is done downstairs in the basement. First of all, I want to thank all of you for your support over the last, Jesus, now 4.5 years. John knows more about how long we've been on because he's got to listen to the whole thing all the time and edit all my nonsense out of it. But we really couldn't do it without you, right? We really couldn't do it without you because ultimately the patrons keep us going. We know that you're out there. So again, thank you guys so much. And what I hope to do is give you a flavor of the sort of stuff I read in order to try and come up with the ideas in the podcast. As you know, in the last couple of weeks, we've been becoming even more historical and connecting the dots between things that happened in Venice and things that happened in the Flight of the Earls. I can promise a couple more of those over the next while. They tend typically to come from a bizarre, curious mind that reads stuff all the time, right? And because of your support, this is the thing, I have the time to do that. So we can focus much more on the podcast. As you'll know, the book I wrote recently was a bit of an exercise in kind of COVID-y research, pandemic research. So there's a huge amount of overlap between the book and the stuff we're going to do now. But what I'm going to try to do in as much as possible is, first of all, turn off my thing. Okay. First of all, hold on. Eliza's just giving me a
It's just me and John.
Just you and John. Okay, right. Fair enough. The funniest thing is when you work with somebody in their 20s, and this is for all the owl fellas and the owl ones online, you know how pathetic we are at technology, right? I'm the sort of man, I have butterfingers. It takes me hours to text to do anything, right? So, first off, right, thank you. Second off, we're going to try and give a flavor of the podcast to this discussion. Thirdly, and it's very typical of me, right? So we were thinking before Christmas and in response to many of you patrons saying, look, we'd love to get a library. We'd love to get a back catalogue. We'd love to know what you are actually reading. I said, great, we will do this. And we're going to do it once a month. We're going to do it probably the last Monday of every month, if that suits everyone. And what I want to do is I want to discuss the book for about an hour. But then I think we'll probably open up to discussions about the state of the world, okay? Because I am sure that everybody is as surprised as myself about what is going on. But I mean, the joy is, as I've always said, it's not really the crisis that is the important thing. It's how you react to the crisis is the most important thing. And armed with the sort of stuff that hopefully we learn during the course of the book club, we will be all pretty well armed to deal with almost anything. But Humankind is a book about the joy, the decency, the communitaire, the cooperation nation, our cooperation element in humans, right? It's basically a book about the fact that we're decent and we're kind and we're gentle and we're caring, right? Now, I picked it in December. Little did I know on the day of the very first book club that we would be marking the third anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine. We would be going into the fourth year of that war. We would have the United States today, amazingly, voting with Russia on the UN Security Council, not to recognize the valiant efforts of Ukraine. We would be looking at a German new chancellor saying that his first and most significant move would to be reduce the American domination of Russia and consequently the German dependency of Russia. I mean, if there is a more inappropriate book to start the bloody book club with, it's this one saying we're all decent fuckers, right? Because obviously we are in a very strange world. So that apart, bear with me. Little did I know. The other thing is what Rutger is trying to say here is that we are fundamentally decent and we do the right thing. And unfortunately, what much of classical economics is based on is on the notion that we are not decent, that we are fundamentally maximizers of our own utility. So we look after number one, we do not collaborate, we are hyper competitive, we are that homo economist, which is that weird and wonderful creature that believes that the rest of us are rational. So if we are to accept what this book has outlined, then we need to reject quite a lot of what economics has been based on in terms of the human being that economists seem to think is representative of the average human being, which is not necessarily a collaborative, cooperative creature, more a hyper-competitive creature. So in a way, as we explore the book, as we go through the examples, as we take some lessons, what we're actually doing is it is an affront to the obsession or the assumptions of most economics, which is that man is rational, man is individualistic, and man tends to maximize their own utility, and in so doing, creates the environment for a more competitive, but ultimately, ironically, more equal world. So that is where we are going with this, right? Now, what I want to do is I want to start, right, with, I'm going to go mainly chronologically. So start at the beginning and going through, right? But I really want to start on part one on page 45, if you have the book there with you, right? And it is, I think, on the essential philosophical arguments that Rutger is trying to make, which are between our friend Hobbes, okay, and our friend Rousseau, because that is, in effect, the meat and drink. Let me get it up here. 45. Where is it now? Right. And what he says, okay, on page 45, and my book is full of little scribbles, okay, down here, things like that, right? But what he says is the two great philosophers, Hobbes, the pessimist, who had have us believe in the wickedness of human nature, the man who asserted that civil society alone can save us from our baser instincts. Rousseau, in the other corner, is a man who basically thought we were lovely, our hearts are good, And far from being our salvation, Rousseau believed that civilization is what ruins us. So the essential argument at the core of these two, and from that all things flow, is that Hobbes believes that we are essentially bad. We have this thin veneer of civility which is stretched over us, but when left to our own devices, we are evil. Okay? And therefore, you need this all-knowing, all-powerful state, which he described as the Leviathan, which, by the way, is a comedy show that I used to, if anybody remembers Leviathan at Electric Picnic many years ago, if you're online, we used to call it Leviathan. But he believes that basically without civilization, we will turn on ourselves. Now, Rousseau took the opposite view. He said, we were grand before civilization, and it's the essential building blocks of civilization that makes man violent. And this is the essential philosophical distinction between two. And I think actually this chapter, just if you have your books handy, right, this chapter, hold on, I'm going to get a little light on it here so I can see everything properly. This chapter is part one, the state of nature. That is really a short little chapter which sums things up. And he says, of these two fellas, few other philosophers have had as profound an impact on politics, on education, on the worldview of these two. The whole science of economics became premised on the Hobbesian notion that human nature, which sees us as rational, self-serving individuals. Rousseau, for his part, has been enormously influential in education due to his belief, revolutionary in the 18th century, that children should grow up free and unfettered. To this day, the influence of Hobbes and Rousseau is staggering. Our modern camps of conservatives and progressives, realists and idealists can be traced back to them. Whenever an idealist advocates for more freedom or equality, Rousseau beams down approvingly. Whenever the cynic grumbles that this will only spark more violence, Hobbes nods in agreement. Now, the first question I have is, who wants to talk me through their impressions of this particular discussion and this, what Rutger would say is this essential conflict at the heart of humanity? So put your hand up and let's start talking like a book club. By the way, I've never done an online book club before. So all advice and help, absolutely wonderfully accepted, not least because I haven't a rash as what I'm doing, but we'll get there. By the fifth book club, we will be the gold standard of book clubs. But right now, we are really groping in the dark in a sort of a Hobbesian world. Who has the first? Let's start chatting now. Eliza, you can have a look and then you'll unmute and then we can start chatting away and I'll be able to see everybody. And I will do I will channel my inner blind boy by having a can of.
No one has their hand up yet.
Who has their hand up? Come on, who wants to talk first? Who wants to talk first? Right? You can't have just me and John all together, right? This is the gang. You're part of the gang now.
Oh yeah, we got someone. Miana, if I'm saying that wrong, I'm sorry.
Mina, is it?
Yeah, hang on. So it's Manya. Thought I'd come off mute. So
Manya, how are you?
Yeah.
Lovely to see you.
Nice to see you. So I thought this was really positive, actually. I really liked this idea, and it made me think about people I interact with or politicians, the news that you hear, and you suddenly start putting people into two categories. Are they fundamentally good and maybe just unfortunate or coming across badly, or are they actually fundamentally terrible and faking it till they make it? So I found it really interesting, and you start to look at people through both lenses. So that's what I thought.
So tell me, so you're sitting at work and you're thinking, is this a child of Rousseau or is this
Yes.
a child of Hobbes?
Yeah.
Now we're going to get onto, because the book does get onto why bosses and power can change fundamental nature.
I did. And we digress, but I did take a picture of the boss eats the biscuits section, the messy eater bosses. and sent it around my WhatsApp group in work for a huge amount of entertainment for some of us because we have a messy boss.
Okay, you have, yeah. And do you think now, the interesting thing is, do you think that boss, before becoming a boss, was more cognizant of the people around him or her?
I would say yes. Having known them for a
Okay.
while, yes.
But by the way, what did you think of the overall thrust of the book? Did you enjoy it? Because
I loved it. I found it actually really positive. In a time when it's difficult to see positivity, I found it really, really positive. And a lot of the data points about war and soldiers don't shoot and that kind of stuff is really interesting and challenging our thinking of, are things really bad actually, or are we just more programmed to be only seeing the bad?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this is why, I mean, even though I started saying, typical me on the day of the anniversary of the invasion, on the day where the behavior of Trump is the polar opposite to everything that Bregman is saying in his book, we open up. But again, I think it gives us latitude to think. We have both Nick Webb and Sean Carroll. Stay on the line. Mine or Mina?
Manya.
Manya. Now,
Yeah.
okay, that's a first for me. Manya, how are you doing?
Great, thanks.
Delighted to meet you.
I was
Okay.
just thinking if we add everyone into the one that wants to speak at once. It's just
Yes,
Nick and
actually,
Sean
that's a
as
good
well.
idea. Yeah, okay, great. So who's here? Nick and Sean, throw them all up and away we go.
Can you hear me?
Sean, how are you doing?
Hello. Not too bad. Not too bad. I'm in flying form. I
Great,
was
good
actually
man.
a wine tasting earlier today, so I'm flying.
That's
was in the
that's the
Westbury
best way to
area, so
discuss
it was nice.
economics.
Yeah,
Great stuff.
absolutely. Look, I'm not a big reader. Absolutely was delighted with opening this dopamine book club. Got me into actual reading. It took
Great.
me a while. I've only finished the book today, earlier today, and like Manya said, there, it goes into the really nitty gritty of what people think, where they see the bad in people or they see the good in people. So,
Yeah.
do if you meet a stranger on the street, do you actually see the good in people, or do you automatically think this person's out to get me? This person's going to try and do one over on me. It really opened up that total lexicon of how you find a stranger, how you define somebody,
Yeah.
which was amazing. When you actually look at the data, and I thought the book was very data focused in the overall, and I found it kind of hard myself to pick apart that, but in the overall, to just see, I think that the main focus was, do you see the bad in people or do you see the good in people? And from the entire book, I thought, I have to say, I like to see the good in people. Even today, meeting people, talking to people, I think most people are very, very good. And it's interesting. Hopefully, later on the conversation might touch on where people of power like Trump and stuff, how do the bad people get in positions to be able to influence the rest of us?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's obviously the last few chapters of the book are basically saying, look, if we're decent skins, right? If in general people are okay, and if in general we behave well, and if the history of humanity is one of collaboration rather than competition, why do so many wankers get to the top? Right?
Exactly.
That's the
Absolutely.
thing, right? And I think all of us, I mean, one of the reasons that I ended up doing this sort of crack for a living, rather than working in big corporations that I worked in the past. John's always amazing. He says, Macker, just stop getting fired, right? But I couldn't, I was
You
one of
don't
these
have a good
people.
track record, in fairness.
I don't. I had to go back to my oldest mate to do a gig. But I'm one of these people who doesn't see the knife coming at all until it's in my back. I could never see it. I I see the good in everyone. I think everyone's decent. And it was only working in large banks and institutions like that where you're kind of robbed of your own freedom in a way, and you're put into the place that you realize, you have to learn the game. And it takes a while, and I just couldn't, I couldn't learn it. I was like, really? me. In fact, I'll tell you, the last time I was fired, Shan, we were living in London, and I don't really smoke cigarettes at all. I didn't never really, but when I'm hassled, I did. And she came home and she looked at me and I had 3 bottles of beer with Staropramen. I remember was when Staropramen was really new, right? The Czech beer, and I was smoking fags on the couch, and she just looked at me. She goes, "Not again." And I said, "Yeah," because I couldn't read the signs. I couldn't read the signs. So let's talk. Who else is it? Nick, how are you doing? Good to see
Yeah,
you.
I'm great, thanks. Yeah, I really enjoyed the book. I cheated a bit. I listened on in the car while I was driving on audiobooks because I had an hour journey in the morning and the evening, so it made good sense to do that. But I'd always divided the world prior to reading the book into givers and takers, and
Nice.
so without knowing it, I was doing Hobbes and Rousseau. So in some ways. But I think some of the experiments that academics have done in terms of trying to prove their theories are quite scary in terms of how they got misinterpreted on the data and how the
Yeah.
media got hold of that and then turned people's views on what were decent people into them being, terrible people. So it's actually really quite scary, the power of, we know the media is very powerful, but how that can be amplified through the media and through people's actions and reactions. So that was really quite an eye-opener for me.
I remember when I was reading that at the end, I have a big thing. It's all the fault of journalists. And I was kind of looking at myself, because, and I love at the end, his advice to everyone is don't watch the news. That's one of his big things.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
Well, it's one thing
there
I've
is,
stopped doing is watching the news actually in the last year.
have
Apart
you?
from things I need to watch through my job or listen to, I work in finance, unfortunately. I stopped listening to the mainstream news completely.
Wow. John is the same. John breaks out in a rash when he goes on Twitter. I have to actually calm him down when he comes here.
Well,
after a while.
Twitter actually is as I was saying before, I find it poison. I loved it at the very beginning, but it's turned more and more to a poison kind of. It's an awful place. I feel awful when I look at Twitter. So I've given it up, and I've given up a lot of social media for that very reason. I'm going to give
You
up
feel
news next.
degraded and cheapened by the whole thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Now,
And it's
tell me-
repetition of the bad news as well. It's not just
Exactly.
constant bad news. It's
Yeah.
constant repetition of the same things, isn't it? There's no diversification of the news really. It's just concentrating on the bad stuff really, and what
Well,
catches
that's one of
people's.
the that's one of the points of the book. That's one of the points that Rutger says. He says, "Look, this is part of the news cycle, which is to inflame us, to threaten us, to make us feel exposed, and there is a sort of a slight dopamine hit from that we all get." And but again, as a man who scribbles for a living, right, I do defend journalism on certain areas. I'm not entirely convinced. Bernice, how are you doing?
Hey, how are you? Nice to meet you.
I'm great. Lovely to see you.
You too. Yeah, actually, it's funny as you start making the comments. I think the Hobbes Rousseau thing, I had heard of them, but never really understood, the background. So it was great to get that. And I think it is very kind of data heavy in the book, but it needs to be because he's really trying to back up his arguments, and I think he does that really well. And a bit like you, I'm a bit of a reformed corporate head, but I work in renewable energy and that side of things. So I think for me, what was really powerful about the whole book was the message that the new realism. So the message that there's this kind of message through media and through everything we see in the world today that being a cynic is being a realist. Whereas
Yes.
I think what this book really does is gives those of us who, are seen to be, these kind of, like you said, not naive, not seeing the knife come until it's in your back, but actually that's not blind optimism or naivety necessarily. There's a way that becomes a new realism based on a different worldview. And I think that's something that if it gives people the courage to kind of almost stand up and say, no, this is who I am, and this is how I see the world, and this is how I deal with others, that can spread, and I think that could be very powerful to come out of it.
Well, no, I'm delighted now that the book had that impact, because it's, I kind of picked it obviously because it's a bit of psychology, it's a bit of history, it's a bit of statistics, it's lots of economics, but it's got an everyday feel, and it is kind of uplifting that you're not in Egypt if you like people. That's quite a nice message, you know. Like
It
if
is,
you
yeah.
actually like people and you're sort of, you know, I have been described by my children as things, but they kind of describe me as this sort of Labrador dad. So you come in and you're like friendly with everyone and you're wagging your tail and everything's fine. And the thing about this book is it was at least you're not a complete sucker, you know.
Yeah,
Leona, how
yeah.
are you? How are you doing? I see
Hiya.
corporate psychotherapy behind you. That always, you know what you're talking about, unlike the rest of us.
Big bloody giveaway, yeah. Sorry about that. Now I'm going to let you all
No,
down shockingly. I was
no.
just thinking what struck me, and I listened to the book as well. I cheated like just one of the others. So on Audible, and I finished it up quite a while ago, but a couple of weeks ago, because I really got stuck in and just listened really quickly. But just as people are talking and being reminded of it, and I suppose like the stuff that I would pick out would my training would tell me unconditional positive regard for the individual, but then I swap into the mob and stuff like that and how we're influenced by mob thinking, and then I go back into like the individual depends on the experience and how they could be cynical and why. Like one of the other comments was about, you know, how is somebody shaped in what they do as an individual versus how like we act then as a kind of more civility or attempted civility maybe. And then I was looking at, you know, just I was very struck then with my own training 20 years ago when I did my undergrad in psychology. But like, you know, all the psychological studies that are mentioned in the book we did, but we didn't get actually the end points of the training. So that's actually quite true, you know, where you only hear the bad details and like this is what the data says, which is not what the data said as well. I actually went and checked back over a lot of the data since, and I was like, oh my God, like and my training is not that old. It's relatively old as such. But then the
So
last
this
thing I
was
was
kind of
thinking
this
about.
was even an eye opener for you that you'd actually done this in college and you'd done. I mean, we can talk. We can talk of the various different. We will talk about the various different Stanley Milgrams and the shock machine and all that sort of things. But you thought actually, yeah, this proves that humans are awful.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I would have thought. And we'd always looking at, because I remember I would have a particular interest in World War II because I did my psychology undergrad with history. And funnily, David, I didn't actually see any economics in the book because obviously I only just focused like brainwashingly on my own topic of interest. And I was like, oh yeah, it's all about just human nature, blah, blah. So I couldn't remember anything about the economical part of it. Sorry to say, so this is going to be an education as well. But then the confirmation bias and how the use of propaganda, like while very relevant back in World War II, World War One, and now today with Trump and everything like that. So like really enjoying the podcast then and that flip. Because I'm listening back to older podcasts as well, and I'm like, oh my God, it's all on repeat, which is kind of scary. But the main thing I kind of took from it was that, you know, we believe, and we had myself and my husband were talking about it, and then a friend of his was saying, no, we're evil, we're wicked. Of course we were all hammering and clubbering one another back in the day when the Stone Age, or like, you know, when we were the beasts and stuff like that. And then to try and convince him otherwise, he was like, no, it's definitely we're wicked. Wicked. So he was definitely in veneer theory with Hobbes, whereas I myself, just from my own training, would be more Rousseau based. But like, you know, when also just as the individual, if you're in a bad space in life, you know, you're going to be more cynical because of the burnout factor as well. So like it's just it opened up a whole new way of thinking and like everybody else has said, and yourself is saying it's great to think that the world is a little bit more positive, and I think it was really good to be reminded of that in January.
Okay, well, I mean, you know, I think that what, and I'm going to come back to it. I have a problem with the notion that when we started to settle down, we became nasty and property and agriculture. But we'll get on to that. We'll get on to that. I need to be convinced of that argument. Connor, how you doing? Connor Murray.
Yeah, all good. I really loved the book actually. It was really really refreshing considering like all of the political like just the news cycle in general. And I felt it like really refreshing actually to listen to that chapter referring to like how actually the psychological effects of tuning into so much news actually it does end up getting you really wound up and high strung. And just overall the book, I think the general kind of push of it. I kind of work as a coach myself, so
Okay, so you
I would
know
have
all
seen
this
like
stuff.
so many parallels between just negativity bias and like a lot of people. I work with people around their body confidence, body image, and those kind of things. And there's like research that I would have seen in relation to body image. There's a thing called normative discontent, where basically the majority of people are actually rating themselves as less attractive than the average person, or most people just think that they're, a little bit less than. And that's like kind of a negativity bias that's inherent to people in general. But I think that just on how you curate your attention, social media, and what kind of media that you like actually tune into, news cycles and all of this gets a bad rap. But that same technology is empowering all of us to come
To do
together and
this sort of stuff.
discuss, you know,
Yeah.
and it's building connections, you know. I mean, I'm living here in Hungary, you know, and this is a bit of a hotbed for you know, spicy news cycles and interesting takes. But you know, still we can you know, use the same technology to connect with people. You know.
Actually,
I mean,
that
this is
sorry, Mac.
go for it, John. Yeah, go for it. Go
No,
for
I
it.
was just going to say, just on that point of normative discontent,
Yes.
I thought it was really interesting that, like, I did a radio documentary
Okay.
on this. God, it must be 15 years ago. On
Mm.
is childhood shrinking, and it was all about, you know, kids looking at social
Yeah.
media and looking at all these, you know, skinny waifs, as it were, and comparing
Yeah.
themselves to that. But before social media, there was Vogue magazine and
Exactly. So it's
Cosmopolitan
like,
and all that. So it was always there in some form or other. Now it just seems to be more in your face.
yeah, it's amplified. You know, I was
Yeah,
even
yeah.
listening to a comedy Finn Taylor's show. He was talking earlier. He was saying like, oh, back in the Renaissance, you know, they were all probably looking at the paintings, saying, "Ah, look,
Yeah,
not a
yeah.
person was looking at the." You know, they were all talking in the square there, you know, together. Nobody was looking at the paintings or the, you know, whatever. It is like, yeah, I think the technology just changes the,
Yeah,
you know,
amplifies it, as you say. Yeah.
But I
yeah.
suppose that the nice thing about this Bregman's worldview is that, in fact, despite all these things, there is an essential decency. But the challenge he has for us is, if this is the case, and we can come on to this, are we looking at the world through economics in particular and through politics in a totally misguided light? That the incentive structures would be much, much more advantageous if we saw people as being congenial, cooperative, decent, etc. Anna, Dwan, how are you? Good to see you.
All good, all good. Similar to Sean now, I have had a few drinks, so not to turn this into a AA meeting.
You.
I'll just preface it with that. No, I found it very conflicting the whole time I was reading it, where in my personal life, I would absolutely agree with all the points he's made. But in the wider news cycle and what's going on in the world, I had a lot of disagreements where I absolutely could see that I do lean into that sort of negativity bias where if I'm meeting someone and my friend beforehand had said, oh yeah, they're a bit of a head wreck, they're a bit of a, you know, whatever, I will immediately see that in that person and kind of lead with the fact that I don't like them, even though I don't even know them. But just because some sort of negative trait might have been pointed out to me beforehand, that is the only thing I then see. So I
Yes.
thought the book was great in terms of teaching me that you need to fucking shut up with that and stop doing that to people. But I found in terms of what's going on in the world, I don't know if he fully convinced me yet that people are inherently good. Like I work in PR and every morning we have to read the papers and update our clients and all the stuff that's going on. And every morning email doesn't tend to be super positive about what's going on in the world. So I think, and I know he did sort of explain, you know, how power changes people and everything, but I still don't know if that's explained enough yet to me, to the point that I'm convinced that everyone is super great.
It's interesting
So
because
I'm
I'm
on the fence.
actually I'm kind of a bit with you on this, you know. I would like to think that he's absolutely right, and I think it's the evidence. You know, there is a thing we call in economics, which is bashing a confession out of the data, right? That you wanna get to a certain place and you get there. But I'm prepared in this discussion also to have my mind changed because I want to have my mind changed more than anything else. Craig Josephine, how are you? Oh no, you wait. Unmute you. We've got it on.
Hello,
Craig,
there you
how
hear
are
me
you?
now. I'm
Yeah.
very well, and yourself? It's a pleasure to meet you and John. We have
Great
actually
to have you.
corresponded in the past. I suggested one time that you get Robert Reich of Berkeley to come on your show,
I
and you
would
said he
love
just
that.
seems to be too busy to do that. But I think you guys would be a great matchup, and a great conversation would
He's one of
ensue.
the great thinkers.
He is. My personal eureka, there were many in reading the book. I was really a pleasure to read this book, but was on page 280 when he talked about how education today is all directed towards keeping the children busy all the time, going to lessons, going to tutoring, I spent a lot of my time as a grandfather of 3 children, driving them to hockey lessons, horseback riding, tennis, et cetera, et cetera. And I think he's absolutely right. This is my feeling before. I couldn't express it the way he did, that it actually stifles creativity and discovery instincts in the children. You know, when do you hear a parent today go out, say to the kids, go outside and play?
Yeah.
You don't. Go get ready for your next session of whatever it might be. So that for me was just a great point in the book. But I have hopefully not going to throw cold water on the whole conversation, because I have the feeling that we can discuss whether or not Hobbes or Rousseau is correct in their point of view or their philosophy on human nature. But isn't the real question whether or not Hobbes hasn't won, that we're so far down the road in that direction that we can't turn back? There's just either numbers make it impossible, there's too many of us, or the aspects of the institutions which have been created are so firmly embedded that even though we might individually take the advice of Mr. Bregman in how we control our individual lives, and there may well be many various projects that are headed in the right direction, is it enough for us to turn back to change ourselves?
Well, you know, it's very interesting. You arrive at this conclusion. Are we too far down the road? In terms of the kids and the play idea, I think everybody has really noticed that. Anybody who's a parent or a grandparent has noticed the amount of time that is spent sort of parenting children and not allowing them to get their own stuff. But on the Hobbes idea, what is I find quite fascinating is that there's a thing in economics, I sometimes talk about the most important thing in macroeconomics is a thing called the paradox of aggregation, which is basically what is good for the individual is not always good for the collective. So the idea is that it sounds really, really good, but when you put us together and you try and get humans to organize themselves in very complex systems, such as, you know, a city. Imagine the amount of relationships that are going on, or a country or a state. It does require a certain Hobbesian worldview to make the whole thing work. And yes, on the one hand, you can cite, you know, very funky Dutch schools in certain small towns in Holland where all the kids are hanging out and they're playing, and 17-year-olds are hanging out with 7-year-olds and all that sort of stuff. I think there is a systematic requirement to have these delineated structures, which might not necessarily be based on the Hobbesian worldview, but they're just based on the fact of this is how to get humans to move in large numbers from one state to another state. And I don't mean that this is a state of, in terms of a state or a country, but from one condition to another. How do you get us to actually cooperate at scale? And sometimes you absolutely need a vertical structure to do that. So I'm kind of with you as well. I'm not a total, I do remember though, what was one of the stories that I loved most was the very first book. Now think about this, that I did in secondary school. When we came out of primary school in Ireland, which we call it national school, and we went into big school. And the very first book that we read in the class was Lord of the Flies. And we were 13 years old.
Yeah.
And the amount of messaging that was inherent in that choice for the school now, I think, is quite apparent. But I'm with you. I'm still open to persuasion. Philip, there you are. I think are you unmuted yet? How are you doing? I think you're unmuted. I think, Eliza, can you unmute Philip? Philip, how are you doing?
Hi David. Hi John. Thanks for
Oh yeah.
having us all on. This is very cool. First book club. But
Great.
yeah, I really like the book in terms of it's not something I really read at all. I'm into kind of military history, war stuff. So this is this is definitely more on the positive angle of
This is
what I
you've got
read, which but
Hitler
it's
or Bergman. Hitler or
yeah.
Bregman.
But no, it is great to get a different perspective. And I think I was just reading, I found one thing interesting because I think the stats he had around past wars and the lack of willingness for people to kill each other and for human kind of violence was really interesting. And I think it kind of led me to think maybe most people are good, but maybe the people who get to the top aren't. Like, you have that whole thing about CEOs being more likely to be sociopathic. And it just got me thinking, I wonder, yes, it's difficult for us to be face-to-face violent, but the way military technology has gone in terms of drone warfare, and even if you look at Gaza now, like, I wonder how much of the Israeli Defense Force are actually looking Gazans face-to-face. And does that allow people to go back to being violent because they're not, having that human interaction with their enemy? So yeah, I just found that the stats stuff so interesting because it goes in the face of all of the military kind of stuff that I'd usually read, where you see millions of people dead, or you see like horrific wars, and you think everyone's kind of getting involved. But yeah, anyway.
Actually, that's interesting because he makes the point, and he drives it home again and again, that when fighting the Germans in the Second World War, the Americans and the Brits and the French and the Russians were amazed at the ferocity of the individual German soldier. And then they all thought that these guys must be ideologically different. They must be fanatics. And then when he actually interviewed all the German soldiers, they were like, no, they were just our mates. Did you buy that as somebody who reads military history?
I don't know. Like, there was a few arguments in it. I was kind of like, yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I just found it.
The idea, like, I mean, I thought it was fascinating, this notion that, as you said, the further you are away from the impact of your violence on somebody, the more likely you are to pull the trigger. And the closer you are, the less likely. And I thought that idea that the muskets in the American Civil War, of which many were completely unused, as opposed to, as you say now, Israeli pilots, Ukrainian drone operators, whatever you take it, you're far away from the actual impact of what you're doing. And was that something that's consistent with what you've read over the years?
Then you've got, yeah, I think he did allude to that when he was talking about it. But then you've got there's even examples in the First World War with trench warfare that, they'd get up and start playing football with each other, or they'd pass each other chocolates and that kind of, versus the Israeli guy in a room in Tel Aviv on a drone. He doesn't care, but he doesn't know the people, and there's that whole dehumanization propaganda. So yeah, I think it's almost as if we got to the point of, maybe not trying to face our enemy or not wanting to kill him, and then we're going back toward the other side. So
from what I gather, and I don't know, but from what I gather, and you probably know, I was in Ukraine twice there last year. It's very much face-to-face stuff. A lot of it is that's going on there, and it's very, very close quarters. Now, Niall Bishop, I see you have an Oasis poster behind you. They announced they were only going to do a 1 hour set today. Yeah, and for Oasis fans, I can give you a heads up. We are going to have Noel Gallagher, who is a mate, on the pod before the gig. And he's all right, I'll do your fucking pod. All right, Davey, I'll do it. So
looking forward to that one.
He's a great philosopher.
I'm going to try and get him for. Yeah, exactly. And he, by the way, just so you know, he is the best crack. He is the king of crack.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Funny, witty, the whole thing. So we're trying to get him on. So anyway, have you bought your ticket for the gigs?
I haven't because I don't think I'd fork 400 quid to see an hour of Oasis. I've seen them a good few times, and I'm not sure I'd fork out that cash for them, to be honest.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think you're
Yeah.
absolutely right.
If they brought back Tony McCarroll, I probably would, but I don't think that'll happen.
Which geezer was Tony McCarroll? Was he
He
one
was
of
the
the
original
original?
drummer that they kicked out because he couldn't drum properly.
It was a fair point.
That's a fair reason.
I digress. I digress.
What's on your mind, Niall? What's on your mind?
So I have a confession, and which is probably, I don't know if it's even a question, but I've only read half the book, so I don't know if I get extra homework. But I can ask
loads of Ecker.
Maybe in the second book club, I'll ask questions on the second half. But so one thing that jumped out for me was the bystander effect.
Yes.
In relation to two things. So you mentioned cooperation at scale, David, and I was thinking about that in relation to what's the guy's name? Hobbes and Rousseau is black and white, it's one or the other. And then cooperation at scale is, and then the individual. So the wants and needs of both is tricky, as we all know. So what was interesting with the bystander effect, which is because I just read it today and it's halfway through, it talks about in 1961 where that girl was killed outside of her apartment.
Kitty Genovese.
Correct. And I couldn't pronounce that name. So Katie, there was supposed to be 37 witnesses that saw it and nobody did anything. It's proof of the bystander effect. I always thought that was bona fide, like true. And that's in my head because it's been quoted in other books. And what he did was actually drill down to the detail of that. And there wasn't really 37 bystanders, as people would have seen in the book. There was a couple of people, but somebody did act. And then he goes on to mention, I think in Holland somewhere, a car went into a dam or went into the river and people jumped in. So it kind of made me think, first of all, he talks about seeing the headline of something. And I know some people who are working in marketing, seeing the headline of something and then buying that on face value. And actually the nuance, the detail is much more intricate. And if we look what's happening in Ukraine with Trump, the optics of what happened in New York with Katie are very striking. And it's easy to take a view, black or white, people are terrible, people are bad, society's breaking down. Similarly, what's going on in Ukraine, the optics is we're going to go in and get a deal, but I don't think you have to be a historian to know like the history of Ukraine and what's going on in Ukraine is very complex and it's nuanced. And that's kind of similar between cooperating at scale. If there was a war, a really bad storm, or somebody breaks into your house, like people, I think the goodness comes out in people. So for example, when you're living in London, it's a rat race and people walk over you. But if you fall coming off the tube, like people will help you. So the goodness comes out of people when there's a crisis, I think. That's what I was getting from it. Like when there's a crisis, like a flood or war or something, people will generally, the best comes out in people. But how that measures up against the individual. So for Katie or the guys in Holland, or you fall off the tube, people will help you, like 7-7. People did remarkably kind things. And then they went off to the pub and went home and never saw some of those people again. And how do you, if we can accept that if something really bad happened tonight, people will come to your aid. But then how does that work with the individual? So I know you guys are going to talk about in New Ireland, what does that look like? And the challenge for that is that scale, we can maybe agree on certain things. But as individuals, we probably couldn't agree on the day of the week. So what you were talking about, Hobbes and Rousseau, well, Liam and Noel can't anyway, but like it took them, 25 years to agree on a few gigs. But with Hobbes and Rousseau, it's kind of black and white, Trump, Russia,
a very
Putin,
expensive,
good guy, bad guy.
Very expensive divorce focuses the mind as far as I can see.
Yeah, that's for sure. That's for
very
sure,
well.
20 million.
But it's interesting you mentioned because the Kitty case or the Katie case was at the very, very end. I've written down here in my notes, it's all journalists' fault, right? That was the way at the end, that they were basically saying the journalists didn't want it. It's a bit like, it goes back to the sort of lesson that we had in The Lord of the Flies versus the kids who actually ended up on the desert island. And at the end of the day, nobody wanted to make the movie because the movie had a happy ending, The actual Lord of the Flies was a really decent one. So you're absolutely right. It's what fascinates about the book is the way in which it takes things that you assume happened and it turns them on their heads and says, you know what? There's a little twist at the end. It's kind of Gladwellian, kind of, if you've ever read Malcolm Gladwell stuff, he does that very, very well. But I agree with you. I think, if you fall in the tube or if you fall in town here in Dublin, you know, people will help you. But also, the Dublin riots showed that once the mob gets going, people are too scared to get involved, you know, and you don't actually get involved. So I've got Heidi there. Heidi, how are you?
Hi.
How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. Calling in
Good to
from
see you.
Norway, so trying to keep up.
Oh God, love you.
I just had an interesting. Well, I'm thinking about in today's world how much propaganda goes into keeping people down, keeping people negative, feeding into the negative emotion. That kind of indicates to me, at least, that we're inherently good and we need force of power to keep us down as a group. And so I was just thinking, I love the book because I'm an optimistic person or realist after being reading the book. And but I do need to get fed some good information or good positive input in this world. So, and when I see the efforts made, the money they put into, and how many people or how much resources they put into propaganda to keep us down, both in Russia, in China, in Syria, in wherever, that kind of proves that it's not our natural inclination to do bad all the time, except for in group when you said panic comes in. So that's my take on that. I think Rousseau.
I'd like to ask you, Heidi, as a Norwegian, what did you make of his examples of the Norwegian prison service and the way he made the point, and I thought it was a good point, right? Which is that a prisoner eventually is going to be somebody's neighbor because they're going to get out at some stage. And as a Norwegian, do you support his observations of the kinder the prison service is, the better the overall outcome for everybody, including the criminal? But what about the victim then?
I'd say, as a neighbor, I'd love for my neighbor to be someone I can trust or at least feel I can live in peace nearby. As a Norwegian, we have these examples. It's true, they exist. It's not how the prison is everywhere in Norway. We've got a huge level of funding. And so we've got prisons that have to shut down because they can't keep up with that very fancy image of what Norwegian prisons are like. That's not the general prison or what it's like in Norway overall, but these two are most part. I do support that if we go from the perspective that they're not supposed to be in prison for life and there's no death penalty or anything, it means they are necessarily coming out at some point. And I haven't been a victim myself to anything that would need prison sentence or anything. But I as a neighbor, I'd love for my neighbor to be someone nice, someone who I can live nearby.
So it's interesting because you're Norwegian, because Norway features, you know, that's an example that Rutger repeats a few times as evidence of, let's say, Rousseauian enlightenment. But I mean, you know, I think Norway, like a lot of Europe, has changed over the last 5 or 6 years. You know, what we're seeing in Germany is a macrocosm of what we're seeing everywhere, particularly down south in Denmark, below you. And, you know, I think that it's interesting. I think the book was written, I think it was published in 2015, and it feels quite 2015. You know what I mean? It feels like a book that's written in a different world.
In the aftermath of 89 still.
Yeah, well, that's very, very true. But I mean, I just wanted to ask you about the Norwegian thing because but listen, wonderful to have you.
I completely support the philosophy of that, and I'm gladly paying my taxes if that is what it means, if it means believing in people and giving them second and third chances. But that's not how it's going in Norway either, unfortunately.
Yes, I've noticed. Actually, we must do a podcast. We must do a podcast on the Scandies, because what's happening in Scandinavia, A, with Russia, B, with the exposure, C, with the abandonment of neutrality, D, with immigration. All these things are coming together in what used to be regarded as the holy of holies of social democracy and all that sort of carry on and all that good stuff. But it's lovely to see you. Lovely to see you. Brian, how are you?
I'm doing great. How you doing, David?
I'm doing very, very well. It's good to put a face to the name.
Yes,
I see you
indeed.
guys.
That is
How
our
you doing,
Brian
Joe?
from California.
You're
Oh,
from a
yeah.
place where they don't treat prisoners
Yes.
very well.
Oh, I'm from Trump land, and here we are. No, first thing I'm going to think, people look at the news, especially TV news, and the first rule of TV news is if it bleeds, it leads.
Yep.
And it's reality, but it's not reality. It's if your child gets lost in the shopping mall, the news of the day is probably somebody's going to find your child and return your child to you. That's who we are. So when you're looking at news, it's when I took journalism, it was like it's weird and wacky stuff. That's what you're looking at when you're looking at journalism, in my mind. So it's in the back of your head, you have to say, this is the weird stuff that happened today. For the most part, everybody's pretty good. You know what I mean?
I agree with you, but I also do agree, having been a TV presenter in my many incarnations, right? Economist, TV
You
presenter.
get fired from that too.
I got fired from it. Yeah, I was too fucking good at that, John. Too fucking good.
The nice people are always coming for you. It's something, I've never had a real job. I'm a bartender / waiter / whatever. And I find myself comfortable in that because there's nobody stabbing me in the back. I find a place to be, nobody's stabbing me in the back. I can read my books and do whatever I want to do. You know what I mean?
Well, the best quote is the opening. If you're interested in the life of bartenders and anybody works, the best quote is the beginning of Kitchen Confidential, right? Where Bourdain is describing the guys he works in the kitchen with. And anybody who's worked in the kitchen, and I have, will know this. And he says, I can trust the guys in the kitchen with my money, my drugs, and my wife. And he said, I cannot say that of anybody else. And he was talking about the camaraderie, the reality of working in the mad intensity of the kitchen or the bar or wherever. And you also see all classes of humanity coming through the bar looking for a drink.
I've met so many people. It's incredible. I can give you stories, but I try not to tell them. I'm like their psychologist. You know what I mean? I can't really. It's doctor-client relationship.
Up the road is John's psychologist and mine.
Yeah, exactly.
Big time.
Exactly. But
I'm looking. Yeah, go for it, Brian.
I was going to tell a story. It's not my story, but it's a great story. I was on the subway and I was trying to get to work and I was really in a bad mood. I'm just trying to read a book and all of a sudden this guy gets on the train with his 3 kids and they're just running around. He's sitting there looking at his hands and they're running and playing and everybody's bothered. I finally get up and I go, what the hell are you doing, man? These 3 kids are bothering everybody on the train. You stop it. And the guy goes, well, they just got out of the hospital. Their mother just died and I don't know how to deal with it. That story, the first part of the story is who we think we are. The last part of the story is who we really are. Because everybody gets up going, what can I do? What can I help you? Can I do? What can I do? Playing with the kids. Because when we are confronted with the reality of a human being in distress, like the person falling down the tube in London, we do change. That's who we are. We're Homo puppy. We are, let me help you out. So much negativity towards the media and journalism because we don't understand it. That's who we are. That's at the end of the day, you're the guy that's going to go play with those kids. You're the woman that's going to say, oh my God, let me help you. Let me talk to you. That's who we really are. And that's a great story. I shared it on Patreon. I don't know if anybody saw it, but at the end of the day, that's exactly who we are. And this book is basically the other thing I thought was, it's all about Trump, right? Is I'm thinking every 80 years in the cycle, we go for these sociopaths in Neil Howe's cycles. And you just wonder, how did they get there? How did we get to this point? To these, and it's not just Trump. I mean, you go around the world, they're all popping their little heads out like whack-a-mole right now. And it's like, how did we get here? It's true. It's like knock Trump down, another one jumps up. It's like, oh Lord.
Well, I mean, I think that is basically where humankind goes, because it basically it says, why do these people emerge with severe regularity? You kind of see them coming. I'm going to have a quick look at some of the just before I go back to the discussion of some of other people's questions. Somebody said, I can't talk, but wondering what you guys think of J.D. Vance's theologian argument. We should look after our family first, then community, then nation, then the rest, as opposed to the Bible's interpretation of love thy neighbor as thyself. little did I know on a Monday night that we'd be getting very, very, very Christian about the whole thing. Okay, but I think Bregman's parents are quite quite religious. Okay, so yeah, well, is this why so many of us struggle to understand so many Americans' lack of empathy? And HK, you're just saying can't talk, but it's because they focus more on the group around them, and they're empathetic to the group around them, which is exactly what Rutger says, I think, in one of the chapters. I have it here in my notes as well. What do people think of that? It's a very, very good question. The J.D. Vance's theologian argument that you should look after your family first, then community, then nation, then the rest. And it's that sort of microcosmic argument that we find, Europeans find hard to
Can I just jump in there, Mike? Sorry,
Yeah.
I just asked Brian, because I know you're based in California. I can't remember whereabouts you are.
I'm in
Brian,
San
by the way, was one
Francisco.
of our very first American listeners to the podcast.
Yes.
I'm in San Francisco, California. I probably need to live near your uncle, which is funny.
Yes. Anyway, no, but I want to ask you just on that point, and it's to the question as well that was texted in, is the LA fires and how that has changed people's attitudes towards each other in bringing people together.
I don't know if it has, but you do feel empathy for them for sure. But I think we're all in our own little world. You know what I mean? Because we all have we have our family first, which is what you have to take care of. Then you have your workmates and your mates. And J.D. Vance is kind of right that way. But when pushed into the right corner, we do stand up for each other.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? It's like, for the most part,
even if you're wearing a Dublin jersey.
Oh, you like that? I dressed for you guys today. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, we're
I
very
got dressed
impressed.
for you, just for you. Like,
very, very impressed.
My
We're
Claire
very
relatives would not be happy with me for wearing this right now. Trust me. I mean, wearing the Jacqueline logos would not be getting me very far with the Claire people. Just so you know.
To move from Jacqueline logos to annoying our country brethren, there is an interesting place that Bergman talks about, and I think it's fair. He's talking about we're jumping up to the idea of how power corrupts, and I think that he concludes this beautiful thing. He says, this is on page 240 of the book, if you have it there. It's a really good quote, and it's kind of, he just basically says, the ultimate secret weapon that these guys have to defeat their competition is they are shameless, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's an extremely interesting thing. He says, in our modern democracy, shamelessness can be positively advantageous. Politicians who aren't hindered by shame are free to do things that the rest of us just wouldn't do.
No.
Would you call yourself your country's most brilliant thinker, which I suspect Mr. Trump does, or boast about your sexual prowess, which he does? Okay. Could you get caught in a lie and then just tell another one without missing a beat? Most people are consumed by shame, just as most people leave the last cookie on the plate, but the shameless couldn't care less.
Yeah,
and their audacious behavior pays dividends in our modern mediocrities, he means places media, because the news spotlight the abnormal and they spotlight the absurd. In this type of world, it is not the friendliest, the most empathetic leaders that rise to the top, but their opposites in this world. It's survival of the shameless.
Yeah.
And I think that is worth considering.
There's a guy named Scaramucci that worked for Trump chief of staff for like 11 days. And he said he'd go on the road with him and say, don't lie, Donald, don't lie. You don't need to lie. You don't need to lie. And he'd get up there and start telling lies and go, what are you doing? He'd say, well, if I tell the lie over and over, they're going to believe it anyway.
Well, there's another man who talked about that. His name was Goebbels, the big lie. Okay?
Exactly, yeah.
But once you start comparing people to Nazis, you lose the argument, as we know. Sean Carroll, you're back in the room. How are you?
Guys.
Not too bad, not too bad. Great conversation, everybody. Just following on from what Philip said earlier about Gaza, and like I think we can all agree what's happening there is absolutely outrageous. Like, why do humans, and we can, I don't know if everyone can agree, but we all fundamentally believe that everyone is good. So why do we follow the bad guy into doing something terrible. So you look at Netanyahu, who is just absolutely obliterating Gaza, and all the Israelis, which I'd say most of them are really decent people. Why are they just going blindly and following this guy into annihilation? Why do the good guys not stand up in situations like this?
Well, I think Craig has just put his hand up maybe to answer that question. And I'm also flipping through all the
I don't know if I'm going to answer it, David, but I did have a thought. By the way, I'm a Californian too, and but I was living in Ireland when I first started listening to you guys. I have recently.
Then you split.
I have recently come into contact with somebody who helps me understand how there can be, I don't know, 70 million people who vote for the current person that we have elected to the presidency of the United States. And what I'm talking about is somebody who is working 2 jobs, has a mountain of debt, can't make ends meet even though they are working, and also coming from a divided or a split family. So, I mean, they don't think about Hobbes or Rousseau. They think about, how am I going to get by? How am I going to get through next week? How am I going to keep the debt collector from coming around and knocking me out of the downgraded housing that I happen to move into, or I happen to be in currently? So I think that, I'm not sure what the conclusion of what I'm saying is, but I begin to understand how there can be people around who will not object to things that I find very objectionable, because they're just not in a position to give consideration to those things. They're trying to live.
Yes.
And it's not working for them.
And I suppose that, this is an expression that we all know, on the breadline. And if you're on the breadline, I've always said that what always intrigued me about the difference between rich and poor people, I've said it in the podcast, but it's worth reiterating. There are obvious differences, we know, but the major difference I always felt was what I describe as time horizons, that rich people have long time horizons. So if you hear middle-class people in Ireland, they talk about their kids' education and maybe going to college and what they're going to do after college. And being reasonably well off allows you to make plans for the future. So you can see into the future, whereas poverty obliterates the future because you require the cash tonight, tomorrow morning, and you don't have the luxury of making these plans. And therefore, once you don't have the luxury of making plans, you don't have the luxury of acquiring those social assets which are essential to get out of poverty, like education, like opportunity, like networks, like taking a chance, all that sort of stuff. So maybe to answer your question, sometimes I think it's very helpful to look at the role time plays in people's expectations of how their lives are. And as a result of that, it brings us to things like the rate of interest. So what you find very, very egregiously is the shorter your time scale, the higher your rate of interest, which is why payday loans are charged at multiples of the 30-year treasury. Because a large corporation can borrow over 30 years, it's got the cred, it gets, 5.5%. Your average dude that you're talking about, who's on a payday loan, is probably paying 20% APR, or maybe more. And the rate of interest is the way in which you can actually, because deep down I am a bit of a mathematician, right? Is the way you can make precise these observations. And you see this happening all the time. And that's why when I look at friends of mine who's, let's say, who weren't born into the middle classes, who struggled but have actually done very well, what I notice with their kids is they can plan, which their dads couldn't, and certainly their granddads couldn't. And I think that's, a big change. And it's maybe a way of looking at, the way I'm slightly non-ideological. So I always try to take the heat out of arguments, right? And it's a way of looking at poverty. But you're absolutely right. Your average person on a payday loan, he's not worrying about Rousseau or Hobbes or Or the Lord of the Flies, or he's not worried about whether or not the shock therapy was right or not, and he's not worried about whether or not Eichmann was actually a wanker or was a fanatic. He's worried about, how do I get through the day? Anna, you're back in the room. How are you?
I am. Yeah, just following on from what Sean and Philip were saying just about Gaza. In terms of why people don't necessarily stand up. I'm just back from Germany. My grandparents are German, and we were there over the weekend. Obviously, they had their big vote. There was a lot of protests and everything. And my grandparents, they grew up obviously during the war, and their view on Gaza is very different. Now, we also watched the German news with them, and it's wildly different in how the war is reported there versus how it is in Ireland. Even though I do wonder, could Ireland do more in terms of how they're reporting on it? But their view, they're very traumatized still by the war. And I think they find it very difficult to understand that Israelis who are predominantly Jewish could be doing something that was done to them not too long ago. And when I try to point out to them that, how can you have like 20,000 children dead and kind of still argue that they are still in their moral right to do so, they find it very difficult to see that, because they do think they're in their right to defend themselves. I would argue they're not defending. But it's very different. And I wonder now, I think Germany is different compared to other countries just given its history. But I do wonder, are there more people in the world than that us in Ireland actually note that view what's going on in Gaza in terms of World War II, and that the Jews, they need to defend themselves because of what we have done to them? Like, I wonder, in Ireland, I think we're generally very pro-Palestinian. But is the rest of the world actually very pro-Israeli because of World War II, and that they might have experienced that conflict a bit more than us in Ireland?
I think what you're highlighting is something really fascinating. You'll know from listening to the podcast that one of my first jobs, one I didn't lose actually, was I ended up being sent to Israel as a young economist by a Swiss bank and living in a place called Ramat Gan, which is a suburb of Tel Aviv, largely populated then and still now by Iraqi Jews, the Jews who were kicked out of Iraq and were kicked out in a matter of months. People who didn't experience the Holocaust, didn't really have a dog in the fight about Zionism, weren't Zionists. But when Israel went to war against the Arabs, or the Arabs went to war against Israel in 47, they were kicked out. And by about 1952, they were gone. And that has always shaped my own worldview of Israel-Palestine, because I lived with refugees, but I live with Jewish refugees, right? And I do think that Germany is always different, because Germany, because of the Holocaust, will always have a Jewish problem. And the problem is that Germany is the guilty partner. But most European countries, particularly places where anti-Semitic was rife, I'm talking Poland, Ukraine, etc., they, I think, have a much more proximate and much more close relationship with Israel and Jewish people in general. I think that Ireland has become more Palestinian than the Palestinians. I mean, in a way, like and I think we might be an outlier. I don't think we realize this. I think you're right. We could be an outlier. I mean, I haven't seen Arab countries actively pushing for an occupied territories bill. Now think about that. If Arab countries aren't doing that, and we are doing that, I think we are. I think we might be out on a limb somewhat, and it'll be interesting to see how the whole thing pans out. And also, as I've said on the podcast, the Trump administration is the most Zionist administration I've ever seen in America. So I'm not too sure how our position will turn out. But to get back to Bregman's idea, I think what you're feeding into is basically your worldview is very much part of what the background noise of your society is. And the background noise of Germany has to be pro-Israeli. It has to be. It can't be anything else.
Yeah, it was really interesting. The night that we landed, there was a stabbing in the Jewish memorial. I don't know if that filtered over into Irish news. And just on the news.
I don't think it did, actually. I don't think it did.
Okay, yeah, there's huge security then. We went over the day after. But what they were saying on the news there in Germany was like this was a anti-Semitic attack, and a lot of what was on the news was about anti-Semitism in Germany. But then they didn't provide any background as to why it was anti-Semitic. The person that was stabbed was from Spain, but it did take place in the Holocaust Memorial. So it was just interesting to see how the news cycle is just so different. And my grandparents were just so inclined to say that was anti-Semitic. But the news didn't actually provide background as to why that attack was considered anti-Semitic, bar the fact that a Syrian had carried out the attack. And in Germany, apparently Syrians are notoriously anti-Semitic, which I would also have questions. Is that just because they might be Muslim and there's a big anti-Muslim agenda or what? I don't know. But it was really interesting to be in Germany kind of during that time. And
no, that is absolutely fascinating. It is fascinating. And again, you know, it's the best thing we can do, I always think, is travel a wee bit, listen to other people, and realize that whether it's about we don't have the monopoly of the truth on any issue. Leona, you're back in the room. I see you there. How are you?
Yeah. Hi, I'm not really sure if I'm going to add anything to what Anna has said, I suppose, or about Gaza or that. But I know last year when we were in Germany, the same kind of thing, just trying to get through some of the German papers with my limited German, but like what they're reporting there is very different to what we see. And I think, you know, you have to be very open to getting your news from different viable areas. But I suppose one thing that was coming up to me, going back to what Craig was talking about and everybody was talking about, I suppose, there for a little while, was the shamelessness and what's going on. And I suppose then when Anna started speaking, I was like, you know, the German shame that would go along with Holocaust, and what I'd written down, just because I have to take notes because I can't concentrate if I don't. But as well as that, it was like, you know, where does shamelessness come from? And it's the lack of, to my mind, macro or micro would be, I would see it in my client work, but even in a bigger world context where there is a real lack of consequence and there's no accountability really. And like, because I think we've moved so far away, like that to have judgment is a wrong thing. It's like very taboo now to be judgmental, whereas like judgments do actually keep us safe. If somebody's walking down the road behind me in the dark evening, like I'm going to judge that person. I'm probably going to run depending on the way their footfalls are, you know, how close they're getting to me and everything like that, you know. So like judgment is not all bad, but it's when it's not balanced, I suppose, and where shamelessness is left, just, you know, people keep getting away with things, like Trump getting away with. There's no consequence for any of the things that he's done, and back in power, a president who's done some of the things he's done is insane.
And we haven't seen the half of it, but you know, a significant portion of American society and a significant portion of Europeans still support his agenda. I just happen to think that we are at the cusp of something very, very new, and that this is not going away, that this is the new movement. Nationalism, ethno-nationalism, protectionism, this notion of the tribe, of the kinship, all these things that were for many, many years in our kind of open society were regarded as flirting with fascism, I think are now going to be regarded as pretty much the mainstream. I mean, what you find in crises is that what was mainstream yesterday becomes redundant today, and what was extreme yesterday becomes mainstream. And that's, I think, where we're going. Michael Corker, you're in the room. Good to see you. How are you doing?
Hi, everybody. Nice to meet you. Love the pod.
Thank you so much.
I just wanted to add to what Leona said. I completely agree with her. And there was part of the book as well that touched on the fact that the hunter-gatherers, at the time when somebody became kind of very proud because they'd been a great hunt or whatever, and they brought meat, the rest of the group basically went out of the way to put them down, to make them feel small again by criticizing them, whatever, because getting ahead of yourself and getting too proud was seen as something bad. And in fact, their leaders were always people that were more humble and more wise. While I was
going to say, Michael, do you think though their mammies were Irish mammies? Because that's how my mother behaved.
Exactly.
My mammy, and John knows her. She's 90 this year. And like, if you have any notions about yourself,
absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, I know, but it's true. Actually, I'm going to read you the passage just so we can remind everything of the book. It's page 233, okay? And it's on the qualities and the characteristics that hunter-gatherers, well, it's on the characteristics that Bregman says the hunter-gatherers valued, because we can't know, right?
No, sure. Yeah.
But generosity, if you were a leader in a hunter-gatherer society, you're generous, you were brave, you were wise, you were charismatic, you were fair, you were impartial, you were reliable, you were tactful, you were strong, and you were humble, right? Now, that is, and I love the idea that leadership was temporary amongst hunter-gatherers. You only did it for a while. And I also remember at that point, do you know the great Irish way of communicating in the slag, right? Where does slagging come from? And I've read a lot of stuff about this sort of psychology over the years. That slagging, I was always intrigued when I was reading my son, who's now 22, but when he was 16, he had a gang of mates, and the way they communicated was they slagged each other unfucking mercifully, right? I mean, it was shocking, right? And but what that was all about in the traditional societies was bringing the big man down. So the big man was dominant, but the kind of smart-ass little fella could actually rebalance the equation by slagging. And when I read that, and then I saw the dynamics in that gang of like 6 young fellas, it was exactly that. It was exactly that, you know? So no, I think that the characteristics there, the generosity, bravery, wisdom, yeah. Although it's very hard to meet those sort of people. I mean, that's a pretty impressive list of.
Yeah, indeed. But it's maybe lacking a little bit now in what we see with some of these people that get to the top. In fact, nobody ever slagged Trump, probably, or he wouldn't accept being slagged, would he? So
no,
probably.
he doesn't. He doesn't like the slag.
Apart from on the podcast.
Apart from John. John gets bothered. John gets Bernice, you're back, and so Sean. And what's on your mind?
Yeah, just linking into what Michael and Leona said there about the shamelessness and lack of consequences and the taking people down a peg. There's kind of 2 linked concepts that I came across that I kind of came into my mind reading this. One was I went through 2 kind of buyouts of a small company by a larger company, right? One was a small company, electricity, well, wasn't so small, but bought by a big company, SC Renewable, Scottish company. And the second one was a small Irish developer called Element Power, bought by a bigger company, Statkraft, Norwegian utility. And 2 extremely different experiences. One was, I would have thought would have been really smooth. You think like Irish and Scottish people are very similar, but was very, very problematic. And the second one was much more seamless when it was Norwegians. And there was a whole kind of integration piece we did, which went into the psychology of it. And they had assessed that distance to power is a really important concept in a culture. And in Norway and Ireland, distance to power is very short. So we have everyone in Ireland knows someone who knows someone in the government, basically, or knows someone who, you know, and the same, and everyone is probably 1 or 2 generations removed from an agricultural background. Same in Norway. It's very different in England and Scotland. And I wonder if the same thing is at play with this whole shamelessness thing, where in a society like America, where the distance to power is very large, it's a very unequal society, the same as England. And that almost lends itself to this shamelessness and lack of consequence that comes through. And is that maybe a reason why we've gone and voted for the boring option in our latest election, which now seems like a fantastic result compared to what's happening elsewhere, you know?
Here.
Yeah. Compared to what's happening in other countries, like.
No, it's true, but I always think that Ireland was the last country to abandon Catholicism and sort of a Christianity, and we'll probably be the last country to abandon wokeism. It'll happen in about 10 years' time after everyone else. We'll be at the tail end of the cycle when everyone else has gone into something else. Sean, I'm going to bring you in, and then I want to. Alicia Hamilton has got a very interesting question here, which is, well, I'll come back to Sean in a second, but I'd like people to think about it. She goes, I would love to explore how to use what we've learned in the book to improve the society change the current situation. I appreciate there are golden rules at the end, but for ourselves. So maybe let's lodge that one before we, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of get towards the end of the discussion of the book, and then I'm just going to throw it open to stuff that's on your mind right now. So we've had the last, few minutes, we talk about questions that you might have for me about, economics, politics, what's going on. But Sean, you're back in the room, and it's not just to look at me, it's got something to say.
Yeah, just a quick one to follow on from the question there was, at the start of Rudinger's book, he goes into when we were hunter-gatherers and we were all together and we were, cozy and we were all helping each other out and stuff. And then I don't know when it changed, maybe civilization, he comes along and says, when we became civilized, we started, the alpha male, the Trump, the Hitler got on top of everybody. And how did the bad seed of everybody get on top, and become this, all knowing God and push all the good people to the side and kind of change the way we look. And there was one question I had there about where do we, you're talking about super cycles. So we've had kind of 50, 60 years of everyone working together, going together, and all of a sudden we have this kind of Trump guy coming out of the woodwork, or Putin, where they're taking over everyone else's goodness, if you get me. So everyone wants to work towards, everyone just wants to work and have a good life. But these guys just seem to pop up every 50, 60 years and kind of throw everything into turmoil. So, why does that happen? And how do we stop it happening? Or how do we, why does it manifest?
Well, it's an interesting, there's a book we could do in the book club called The Fourth Turning by Neil Howe, who's a guy I know, and he's been on the podcast, and he's a very interesting thinker. And he makes the point that these are reasonably foreseeable cycles, and they're to do with generations and how generations deal with each other. I do happen to think that there is a very significant generational content to what we're seeing. I think that there is a generation coming behind us that feel really quite disenfranchised, feel quite locked out. I think what's very interesting, if you look at the German elections yesterday, the way that young men tilted right very significantly, but young women tilted left very significantly. But taken together, people under 35 or sorry, under 25 voted either extreme right or extreme left in multiples of the way they voted for the center. And that's a signal. I think that the way I look at what has happened in, for example, the United States, or what happened in the UK with Brexit, or what happened with Le Pen or Maloney, or all these kind of monumental changes, is that these people are all evidence of something fundamentally wrong with the proposition that was offered to the majority of people. And I think they are not creations of social media exclusively, or they're not creations of reality TV exclusively, although it didn't do Donald Trump any harm, The Apprentice, at all. There's no doubt. But I think they are evidence that something in the system is not working for enough people. And I think that if we in Ireland blindly turn our eyes away from that and avert the difficult questions of what is wrong and what can we do to fix that, then I think we not so much run the risk here, because I think a bit like the Germans, we have this very complicated PR system which is designed to keep extremists out. As the Shinners experienced over the years, they got to whatever it was at one stage, 30-odd% in the polls, but never really made the breakthrough because the system is designed for preferences, as the German system is. But I think that we should not point our fingers and say, Rutger Bregman is right. We're all really nice people. We've all been manipulated by somebody else. And you know what? That fella Trump is all wrong. Because then I think you cede the argument to other people. I think the point of the podcast and the point of thinking is that we continue all the time to try explain to ourselves, why is this happening? So if you see, for example, the streams of historical reasons for example, the rise of Hitler. And it's the First World War, and it's the reparations, and it's the humiliation the Germans felt, and it's the inequality, and it's the alleged depravity of the Weimar Republic, and it's the activity, and suddenly, in hindsight, all of these things make sense. And you say, yeah, actually, yeah. And did that directly lead to the Holocaust? No, but he said he was going to do it. And he did it, right? This is the taking them seriously and literally. So my takeaway for all this, and Fred, as I said, because you're now part of the gang, God love you, we'll maybe have this with McKenna's the next time. Be raucous, okay? Up in Dunleary, you take the back room. But let's look at what is happening now in Ukraine, what is happening possibly in China and Taiwan, what is happening in Germany, what is happening in the UK, as evidence that the system is not delivering to enough people, that people don't feel the progress, that there is a culture war on, I happen to be a liberal, my crowd have lost in America, right? And the great thing about democracy is the essential proof of democracy is losing, not winning. Because if you lose, it means the democracy is working, because the other crowd win. If you're winning all the time, you are the dictator. So, losing is part of the democratic process, and being part of or identified in a culture war is also part of a process. And I think what we're trying to do in the podcast is to shed light on or explain or at least appraise yourself of the evidence which is delivering these things. And over the next couple of weeks, who knows? We'll try and keep everyone up to speed. Just finally, though, maybe, I don't know, Eliza, is there any way that we can have a show of hands or a poll about this book? Did people were you persuaded by the arguments? And the core argument is that Rutger makes, which is that we have been forced to think about humanity as evil, potentially wrongdoing, and ultimately very, very narcissistic, where in reality we are the opposite. And his conclusion is we have been forced to think about ourselves as an animal that only exists in a dystopian Hobbesian world, and in reality we are more homo puppy, as he says, than this homo economist, which my tribe says we are, which is selfish and venal and narcissistic and self-regarding. So is there a way?
You can react like with a thumbs up or something. That's kind of the only way we can do it. There's no way we can do a poll or text in the chat.
Okay,
Yeah.
well maybe
but you can react.
You can see it. So thumbs up
I
if
think everyone can
yes,
see it. Can you see the rocket?
Rutger is right. Okay. And we have been hoodwinked. Our thumbs up, no, we are actually an unpleasant species. Away we go.
Can you see that? Can everyone see it?
I can see you.
Yeah.
Philip's going. Philip, the military historian's having none of it. Sean is going, yeah, I can see it. I can see it. Look, it's been great fun. I hope you've enjoyed it. Now, next time out, right? Okay. And next time out, we have this book, right? The reason we're doing this book, it's called Manias, Panics, and Crashes. It's a tricky one, right? And I've got the most recent edition, but I might revisit it this week because I'm going to try and speed read it again. It's heavy on finance and economics, but the reason I pick it is because I think we are going through a mania, and there will be a panic, and there will be a crash. Okay, that's the reason. It's written by a fellow called Charles Kindleberger, probably the finest thinker on economic credit cycles, financial cycles. The book is tricky. It's a book that I teach in final year in monetary economics at Trinity, so it requires a little bit of knowledge, but I think it's worth it. However, what I might do is I might try and get a more accessible version of this book, and I'll give you a heads up maybe before the end of the week. But the reason we do it is because I want you to be up to speed on the economic and financial theory behind credit cycles, because I think we're at the end of a monumental one. And in the same way as we are seeing our political world revolve and change and throw up all sorts of weird things at the end of a super cycle. I think we're at the end of a massive credit super cycle. And I want everybody who's a Patreon to be rewarded by being up to speed on this stuff. But I'll have a look at it. It's a bit feckin' turgid. I'd forgotten how turgid it was. I was reading it this morning, like, oh, fuck's sake. Write properly, for God's sake, right? But I'll keep you up to date on that. But that's for 4 weeks' time. And I think all will be revealed. Finally, before we go, 1 or 2 questions on the world, or are we tired? Or is it time? Oh, let's do another 10 minutes. What is on your? Anybody got 1 question finally, or 2 questions, and then we'll skedaddle on economics, on politics, on geostrategy, on Ireland. For example, we've been very quiet about Ireland. Most of us happen to live here, and.
I'm going to ask you a question, actually, just on the German elections, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Because we were talking earlier about bringing people together, especially in times of crisis and stuff. But do you think Merz came out today in Germany to say that, he is going to bring the EU together. Do you think that's possible? Do you think he would be able to do that? And how does it feed into what the discussions of earlier?
Okay, so if you look at the European Union, John, I think it was Mitterrand said that Europe is forged in crisis. And what he meant by that was the European Union goes along, potters along, blah, 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 blah. And then once a crisis happens, it focuses minds and things happen, right? So the last big one, of course, is the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the fall of the Berlin Wall was reacted to incredibly swiftly by the EU. Most countries were absorbed into the EU very, very successfully. And it kind of pottered along after that. I think that one of our dilemmas is that we are English speakers. And we are therefore extremely porous to propaganda coming from England about the European Union. So when I worked in the city in London, having carried the bag for the governor here at European negotiations, only as a kid, but observing as a kid what was going on. In England, I would say every month, one investment bank after another would write a report on how the European Union will collapse in the next 12 months. There was a sort of an Armageddonist idea, right? The euro will collapse, the European Union will collapse, the Germans don't like the French, yada, yada, yada. And amazingly, it's still here. So to answer your question, Europe can only unify with German hegemony in the center. You need a hegemon, you need a boss country. And Germany is the boss country. The dilemma for the Germans, and I'm sure somebody's grandparents will be listening to this, but the dilemma for the Germans is that Germany sometimes doesn't want to lead, and sometimes the rest of Europe doesn't want Germany to lead because of the historical background. But Germany is faced in the Ukraine with a serious, serious dilemma, which is that if Putin wins in the Ukraine, the threat to the German hinterland of Central and Eastern Europe is that Russia, it's not that Russia's going to invade Poland, I don't think it will, but Russia becomes the dominant player there. So I think that Merz will probably surprise on the upside. There hasn't been a surprising German leader since Helmut Kohl, okay? By that I mean a German leader who understands what is right for Germany and what is right for Europe. In fact, I was just reading a book. We're going to talk in the next podcast, John, about Konrad Adenauer and Helmut Kohl. We might talk about that tomorrow for Thursday's podcast. I think the short answer is, John, yes, they can. And the shorter answer is, I also think that we might be surprised how quickly Europe galvanizes. The longer dilemma for Ireland is this means a European army. I think NATO is dead. I think the Americans are gone from NATO.
Mm.
And a European army means that we cannot remain thinking that we can be a la carte Europeans.
Yeah.
So we just want the starter, but we don't want the main course, and we don't want the thing, I think that's, and I think the Germans will move swiftly. So there, I think we leave it. It's been wonderful. We've had dozens of people on the line. I hope you've enjoyed it. I certainly have enjoyed reading the book on your behalf and on my behalf. And next time out, we will be talking about Manias, Panics and Crashes by Kindleberger. But as I said, I might find a more accessible version of this tome. So wonderful to see you all, and we'll chat soon.